This is Artist Point in Grand Marais. Grand Marais is a town of artists and musicians and builders. And speaking of builders, today we're going to talk about constructors. Today we're going to tackle constructors and do a little practice with them. But first a quick review, and also I'd like to highlight some terminology that comes into play with object-oriented programming. You'll see the terminology in red. Every time you create an object based on a class definition, like you see here, stu is an object from the student class definition. That object contains a whole bunch of member functions and data members that the constructor creates. We say that every constructed object is an instance of the class. So constructors instantiate objects, and each object is an instance of the class and contains variables defined by that class. Each of the variables inside that object is called an instance variable. So in this case we could see if the class definition is for an ID, credits, and GPA, those three variables will be present in every student object that's created. The client, which is the main program, instantiates objects, makes objects. The constructor does the work, brings together all the spaces in memory to store the data, and that allows us to assign values to each of those instance variables as the program goes on. Default constructors are the ones that happen all by themselves. All constructors have the same name as a class, so the default constructor has the same name as well. And if you could see it, it would look like this. It's a function that doesn't do much, that can be called. We've seen that we can take over the default constructor and add our own initializing statements, in this case setting all the variables to 0. And that's great. That means that every object that's instantiated from this class has its data members set to 0 by default. Initializing constructors are a little different. Initializing constructors allow us to drop data in as an argument in the construction process so that that data is used as the object is created. So here the client, the main program, creates a student object and assigns it an ID number as it does that. In this example, the student class has an initializing constructor called student, and we're able to take an ID number that comes in as an argument and plug it into the ID number as we construct the object. So the main program, we call that the client. The client code has several options. It can construct things using the default constructor or the initializing constructor. Now let's take a look at an example. If you've ever been on Facebook, you know Facebook has a profile for every person. And so we can think of Facebook as perhaps having a class definition for what a profile is. So look at this particular profile here. You can enter your own data for your name, your age, your workplace, and so on. Now, if you were writing the code for this class definition, how would you write a default constructor for a profile that would assign the name to be unknown and the age to be 0? Pause this slide, see if you can write that, and then take a look at the next one. Here is your default constructor. Next, consider what it would take if you were the client to write a line of code that creates or constructs an instance of the profile class called me using the default constructor. Pause this slide and see if you can come up with that code. Here's the code. We instantiate an object called me of the profile class, and the default constructor puts unknown into name and 0 into age. What would it look like if you wanted to use an initializing constructor to put a name and an age in? Consider this, pause this slide, and see if you can write the client code that would instantiate an object using an initializing constructor. Here is the initializing constructor. The name and the age have gone into the process of construction when we created the me object. In the class definition, you'd have to write the code for this initializing constructor, pause this slide, and give it a shot. It should look something like this. The initializing constructor has two parameters for name and age, and we plug those in to the data members. That's it for now. Thanks for watching.